Welcome to A Game of Ice and Fire, a video series devoted to a Song of Ice and Fire wargame by Coolman You're Not. We cover all aspects of the hobby with tactics and list build videos, painting tutorials of varying levels, and battle reports. Welcome to the second video in my rambling series. In this video, I want to talk about tournament prep and what I go through. Now, I've been trying to make this video for the last 7 hours, and I've just had some problems with my audio, and I think I've got it worked out now, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't putting out anything garbage out there, even though chances are most of you are already at Adepticon that are going to be going there, or have already packed yourselves up and are in bed waiting to go, and this video will be of very little use to you by now. But if you're a new player, you're new to wargaming in general, or you're new to the tournament scene, hopefully this can give you some steps to follow in order to make sure that you are best prepared to go to a big event at a convention, or even just a not so local event for you. The first thing to try and look into is reviewing the tournament rules for the event that you're going to be attending. A Song of Ice and Fire currently is still a very young game in terms of wargaming in general, and some event organizers might not know that the organized play document or the tournament guidelines document exists that drives the standard for a Song of Ice and Fire tournaments, or they do know it exists and they just want to try and cater their events more to their local players' experience level, or they just like doing their own thing because it's what they like doing. You're kind of at the mercy of the organizer because they're the ones who are organizing it. But making sure that you understand their rules before you show up to their event is important, because you might come in with your normal expectation of a tournament, bringing your two 40-point lists and feel like you're ready and raring to go, and then you find out that it's only one list and it's 35 points, and now you can start using some of those Kickstarter models that haven't been released, so you're staring around, or you're staring down the barrel of like 6 Mountain That Rides players or something like that. So make sure that you review them just to see what it is that you're going to be able to do at that event. While I'm going through this, I also like to review the scenarios if they've been presented to me beforehand, and if not, I just like to brush up on some of the rules on them to make sure that I'm not engaging in interpreting the scenario, and that I'm more engaging in the game that I'm playing. So things like Feast of Crows is a good example. When do you trigger the morale checks, and what's the modifier for those? Do I actually lose models for the morale check? Things like that. Those small nuances that exist in each scenario, since they are so different. Fire and Blood's another really great example, because you only score points one way in that game, and it's by killing stuff. But there happens to be 4 different modes of scoring those points. So you want to make sure that you have that under control as well, so you're not trying to review those midway through the tournament as well, or you might get lost in it and think you've won earlier than what you should have, or you've taken a really short game and drug it out real long because you weren't calculating your points properly. Another thing to do right now is also take a look at the terrain rules and just get familiar with the actual modifiers that come with the terrain, and which terrain pieces those modifiers are associated with. Whether you're going to an event where you're playing against people you've never played before, or you're going to an event where the tournament organizer is setting up the tables beforehand, you want to get an idea of the different types of terrain out there, because you might not ever see forests in your area, but then you end up playing on a table that's got 2 different forests, or your opponent ends up dropping something like a hedge, things you're not used to seeing. It's a good time to try and refamiliarize yourself with those, and both the terrain rules and the scenario elements are very small in the amount of wording that's on them, so what you can do is print those out to like a note card size sheet of paper, so that you have a reference easily, so you don't have to go digging through a rule book that may be out of date, or you've got to pull up a PDF on your phone and then you forget where it is and you have to search for a while and you're wasting valuable time where you could be engaging in your game, but instead you've got your nose buried in some rules. Another thing to do before the event starts is make sure you've got your models, your lists, your tokens, cards, dice, any kind of other implement that you might use to aid you during that tournament. One of the worst things that can happen when you show up for an event is realizing you forgot a unit at home and the store or the venue doesn't quite have the thing you're looking for in order to just grab it real quick so you can have it and get it in your list. One of the reasons that I write my list down beforehand is not just to double check to make sure I've got all my models in my bag, but also so that I stop myself from changing my list a couple hours before the event. You know, I could walk into the store with no list committed, and as I'm writing things down, I'm like, you know what, I really did want to try some Kranigman in this list just to see how they would function. And then by the time I get to the second round, I realize that whatever I took out really broke some of the synergy in my list and that it's not really coming together for me. Tournaments can be a great place to test things like that, but in general, if you've been practicing a list for, you know, a couple weeks or a month, and you go to an event just to change it right away, you're not really doing yourself a whole lot of favors there. So you might as well just get it locked in. When it's on paper, it's just kind of harder to change. So just get that set up so you don't tempt yourself to do anything like that. In the tournament guidelines document, there's a sheet at the end of it that you can print out where you can write your list out that way. You can also type it in there and print it off if you want. A Song of Ice and Fire Builder.com, that's ASO AIF, right? A Song of Ice and Fire. It's the abbreviation for A Song of Ice and Fire, not the way it's spelt out. But that website, you can create your lists on there and then convert them over to a PDF to where they can be printed off your computer that way. I think that same functionality exists in the War Council app, but I've never really utilized it in that capacity before, so I'm not 100% sure on that one. I also, I own at least 2 or 3 overpriced garbage tape measures because I have left my measuring sticks at home when I was getting ready for a tournament or found out they were in some other bag. And one of the reasons why I like using measuring sticks is because they take away the debate of what distances might be. So when you're measuring in just one inaccurate unit, like through a tape measure or the little 12-inch sticks that they give you, it's kind of hard to get those exact measurements. So when I have something that's cut to exactly 7 inches, I can just slap that between the models and work out whether a charge needs a 3 to be rolled or a 2. So that's just my side rant on measuring sticks. But when you get all these cards out, you want to also go over all of the rules that you have. I know that if you've been playing the lists for a really long time, you might feel like you don't need to do this, but there are small rules that might creep up on you that you hadn't noticed before. A good example are Great Axe or House Umber Great Axes for me. When I play them, I'm not typically going down to only 1 rank. They usually survive for quite a long time, or they get wiped out real fast. And I didn't realize that they have a rule on their card that says when you choose the Executioner's Blow mode, if you have only 1 rank left, you get Critical Blow. And that's a pretty cool ability to have when you're trying to dig yourself out of an attrition war that you're losing. So just making sure you go through and hit some of those items makes it so that you don't have to worry about trying to learn them halfway through or walk away from a losing game when you had some tools that could have helped you win that game. In addition to trying to familiarize myself with my lists, I also like to review other lists that have been popular or have been placing well. And right now, A Song of Ice and Fire competitive community is a good location for that. They've got a section for tournaments, although I only think there's 1 set of live tournament data from that pool. So as the game progresses and convention season kind of gets kicking here, we might start seeing more lists pour into there. But when they do, you can start to see things like how many four flayed men lists are placing in the top three. Are Night's Watch still something that I really need to watch out for, or are the Lannister panic lists doing really well? So you can kind of craft what your list creation needs to be based on what some people might be using in the general meta. Now, just because the general meta is utilizing some of those lists doesn't mean it exactly translates to some of your more not so local events. And as the game gets larger, it might be harder to keep track of some of those unless the population of people playing it grow with it. But it's still a great tool to utilize and a great location for it. The other thing you can do through this process is also just familiarize yourself with some lists you might not be 100% certain on what they do. So instead of showing up to a tournament and getting to round 3 just to play against a high sparrow list that rolls you because you really don't know how the interactions work, you might be able to see that list online and get an idea of what it does, so you can at least not get blindsided by it when you end up playing on it or playing against it. Another thing to mention here is judges and their role in events. So most conventions, you're going to have some type of judge entity, or the event organizers are going to take that role at smaller events. And judges are really there to be a resource to help you get through some of the contentious parts of your game. And it's interesting to see older players playing against some newer players when the older player calls out judge, and then the newer player kind of has this strange reaction to it. They're either scared or anxious that they might have done something wrong, or they think that person's being an ass because they're calling them out for getting a rule wrong. But when in all actuality, they could just be asking the tournament organizer if a trigger on a card that they're going to play works the way they think it's supposed to. Judges are definitely there to officiate as a neutral party, even as a player and an opponent, like me personally or an opponent. Both of us kind of have a biased perspective when we come to this game. You either want to win, and it's not like you're going to try and stretch the rules to make it so you're going to win or break some rules here and there, but you do want to you do want to produce some results from this game. You want to play as well as you can. Or you could be taking the perspective of, I don't want to screw over my opponent, so if they do call me on a rule, they might know the rules better than me, so I'm just going to go with whatever they say. So you kind of get into this opposite role from the one that we think that the try-hard player might be coming from. So just calling a judge over and making sure that they've got the proper ruling for you in that game is going to make it so you don't have these awkward moments after an event where you say, well, I would have won that round, but we tried to hash out a rule and I just went with what they said. Turns out that rule was wrong and I lost the game because of it. You don't want to have that kind of feeling after an event, so utilizing the judges as much as you can will make sure that you can have a good, enjoyable experience. You also don't want to be spending 15 minutes arguing with your opponent and digging through the rules to find an answer to something, and then just run out of time on the round and end up with a double loss or a draw. Not that that's what every single tournament's going to follow, because some are a little bit more lenient on round timing rules, but sometimes they just don't have that luxury of the buffer built in, so they have to stack the results somehow. So the next part I want to get into here is going to be a little bit more of a tough concept to chew on for some people who might not be used to this concept in wargaming, but it's the two-list pairing process that I've alluded to in a couple other videos. And the tournament document states that you can bring one list, and that can be your only list, but you have the option to bring a second one. So I think as the game evolves more and more people play and tournaments become more of a mainstay in the Song of Ice and Fire community, that two-list pairing is going to be more present in the competitive field. So even if you're coming from a position of, I have my one list and I like this list, I don't want to try and build a second one, or because you're very comfortable with that list, or you're saying, well, I don't want to try and complicate my game with the second list and make it so it's just funky for me. You have to accept that if you play against someone who has two lists in their pairing, uh, you're more likely to have a disadvantaged game, and that might not leave you walking away with the best experience from a tournament, because you'll just be you'll always have the odds stacked against you, because your opponent's going to take a look at your one list and say, okay, which one of my two lists beats this one specifically, because they haven't given me a second list to have this conflict of choice with. When you do have two lists, your opponent kind of has to weigh out, if they drop this one, which one of my lists is better advantaged into that? And if there is one list that's better into that one, is it also good into the other list they drop? There's a whole dance you have to go through to try and figure out which one's the right call. And by only bringing one list, you're kind of robbing yourself from that extra layer of complexity in the game. So there's a few different concepts or frameworks you can play in with the two list pairing process, and I'm going to go through those here. So the first one that we come across is the more common one, and I think no matter how the game evolves, these concepts are going to be pretty much the same throughout the entirety of the game's life. But the more common one that people utilize early on is the idea of an all-comer list paired with a list that kind of fills the holes. So think of the list that you've been playing for months, or maybe it's the same list you've been playing since you started the game. This is the one that you're most familiar with. You understand every nuance of how it works, but you also understand what it has problems with. And with that, in the two list pairing process, you can build a list that fills some of those holes. So let's say you're playing a Stark list that just for some reason can choke on any list your opponent brings that has more than one unit of flayed men in it. Now you can go ahead and play that main list, and then if you ever run across that flayed men issue, you can build a secondary list that is solely utilized to go into those flayed men, so that you can have a better experience in that game and actually set it so you're not disadvantaged, really. The next one to hit is the idea of scenario hunting. This is a lot like the all-comer and the hole-filling concept, but instead you're taking a list that you feel is more general, and then planning for scenarios instead of problem areas that you might have. The best example I can think of right now is something like a Brendan Tully Blackfish list that has a couple units of Tully Sworn shields. That list is going to be pretty slow. So if you're playing a scenario like Game of Thrones or Winds of Winter, where you have to be extremely adaptable on the tabletop, having a slow-paced list isn't going to really help you out a whole lot into winning that game through points. The Stark deck might be able to supplement that a little bit, but it's not going to completely solve your problems. If your opponent for some reason deploys an objective on the furthest corner of the table that they possibly can in the deployable area, and that one ends up being something really powerful like shutting off an NCU, you're not going to be able to get it before the game's over, and that could definitely be the thing that loses you the game, is that you just couldn't get anything onto that objective and take it away from your opponent. Also with Winds of Winter, if a certain secret objective flips up that requires you to get to another side of the table, you just don't have the speed to get there. So you have to rely on your tactics deck, and that might not, it's not always going to pan out for you. So instead, you build a secondary list to be a little bit quicker, something like Robb Stark, where you can throw down a lot of movement shenanigans and get to where you want to in order to get some of these objectives or secret goals met. So that's another way of taking it, especially now that Fire and Blood is out, and that game is very punchy. So if you don't have a list that's meant to take out a bunch of models like that, you could find yourself wanting a second list to build into the into your pair so that you can have an answer to the Fire and Blood scenario. This other set is one that I it's a little bit hard to explain, but once I break down a list, it'll be easier. It's the same but different concept. And this is where you take the same core and put that in both of your lists, but then add a few elements to the side of it that kind of change how it reacts to your opponent. A really good example here is Night's Watch. Sworn Brothers are kind of like the staple of the army. It's the unit you see the most. You can almost guarantee that every Night's Watch list you play against is going to have at least 2 Sworn Brother units, and sometimes it's common to see 3 or 4. So if you take that Sworn Brother core and then put something like Ranger Trackers or Ranger Hunters with it, things that are supposed to help maybe put out those vulnerable tokens to make it so the Sworn Brothers can cut through armor a little bit better, or you bring those Ranger Hunters to have something that can run over to a scenario piece and start harassing the enemies from strange angles. That's one way to build your list. And then you keep that same core of Sworn Brothers in the second list, but then you put something in there like a couple Scorpion Builder crews so that you can have a better answer to something like Free Folk, where you can throw a lot of dice from those 2 Scorpion Builder crew units, or if they happen to have giants with them, you can deal with the weird armor save issue that they have and just go straight past that rule and take them out just from the shots from the Scorpion. So whether you like that unit or not, those are 2 different ways to present the same type of list with just a few nuances that make it different enough to where you have diverse answers to different lists you might see. The last concept I want to talk about in the 2 list pairing construct is 2 lists, but the intention of only playing one. So we can take this from maybe a Lannister perspective. You have your main list, the one you want to play. So this can go back to those people we talked about earlier that are really familiar with the one list that they have, and that they just want to continue to use that throughout the day because they're familiar with it. If you take that same player who would normally show up with only one list and then put a second one on there, things change drastically. Their intention when they come in is that they're only going to play that Lannister panic list. But then they have on the second list built in the Mountain That Rides with the Knights of Casterly Rock and, Tyrion Lannister, the half-man leading the army. A really punchy, difficult army to deal with, but one that they don't want to play whatsoever. So your opponent's going to have to make some interesting decisions on which list they want to drop into you, but they have no idea that you really don't care what it is they have on that 2-list pair that they've got in front of you. You're going to play your panic list. This kind of sounds a little skeezy, but I promise you that it might just barely feel that way. There's no problem with bringing the 2 lists and saying to yourself that no matter what, you're only going to play this one list. You could leave the other models packed up in your bag for all I care. It's still something that your opponent's going to have to consider, and it makes it so that you're not just presenting them a single list that they have to work through. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to tournament preparation is something we really haven't talked even in the realm of yet, and that's personal care. So you have to have your physical game on as well as your mental game when it comes to playing in an event that might go 3 or 4 rounds, maybe even 5. So the things that you should keep with you are water and maybe some kind of substantial snack like a protein bar or beef jerky or something. You never know how these events or conventions are going to go for you. And if you have a tournament that lets you out for lunch after the first round, and you've got a concession stand that's near you, but now you realize that it's a normal people lunchtime, and there's maybe 20, 30 people outside that concession stand waiting to get food, you've only got 15, 20 minutes to get over there and grab it and then come back and eat it so you can get ready for your second round. So you might end up just skipping lunch, and then by the third round you end up getting hunger pains and get cranky, and no one wants to deal with that, neither you nor your opponent. Water's super important too. If you've been drinking a bunch of caffeine all day, you're going to get dehydrated faster. So having a bottle of water with you to make sure that you stay hydrated and don't get nauseous, or make it so that the rest of your night sucks and then maybe carries over into the next day, is also super important. So don't think that tournament preparation stops at just the game itself. You need to make sure that your body is well taken care of so that you can put up with the endurance that comes with playing in these long tournaments. So if you have any other tournament prep rituals that you happen to go through, feel free to post them in the comments below. And if you have any more questions on this two-list pairing discussion, you can also put those down in the comments or buzz on over to my Facebook page at Big Top Gaming, and we can carry on a discussion over there as well. On that note, this is probably going to be the last video that I post for the Adepticon weekend, but I will be doing things like updating that Facebook page with pictures of cool painted things that I see, the tournament photos, probably going to be scouting some tournament lists to try and compile those to get them over to the A Song of Ice and Fire competitive community. I'm also going to be posting any spoilers that I might tease out of some of the staffers there if I can make that happen. So if you can't make it to Adepticon, make sure that you like that page if you want to stay informed. Otherwise, when I get back from Adepticon, I'll probably be making some videos going over some of the recaps on my tournament, and maybe have some other cool things in store for you once I get back as well. So if you're going to Adepticon, you're more than welcome to hit me up for a game. Message me through the Facebook page for Big Top Gaming or on my personal one. However you need to get a hold of me. Send a raven if it really makes you happy. I don't actually know if I would get one because I've never been sent a bird with a message before. But at any rate, have a good weekend, and I look forward to getting back and sharing all the fun stuff that I've come up with at Adepticon.